So I decided to replace the control arms instead of just pushing out the ball joints, and I'll explain why. Here we have the old control arm, here's the new one. These bushings are getting on 20 years old, so they may not be in terrible shape, but these ones are brand new, and I've always felt like these Moog control arms have a higher quality rubber than the OEM. So it's really not that hard to do this. I might as well put the whole control arm in. The other thing is, to do just a ball joint, you got to press the ball joint out. Now I am going to have to press the lower ball joint out. But here, I just put a new control arm in. It's got the new ball joint, it's got new bushings. It's easier. The less you got to mess with pressing these things out, the better. Another thing is, this ball joint isn't terrible. There's not actually any slop when you move the tire by hand. But again, this is almost 20 years old. And look how easily this flops around. It's pretty loose. And when you got 2 tons of vehicle sitting on it, you can imagine that that thing moves quite easily. Brand new one, really tight, really stiff. Obviously, it'll loosen up as soon as, again, 2 tons of movement are put on there. But this is going to make a serious difference in how my steering wheel feels. The whole reason I'm doing this is because my steering wheel, when I'm going down the road, the alignment's fine, but there's just an annoying little slop. And it's not the tie rods. I've done all the tie rods. This is going to tighten it up to where as I'm going down the highway at 70, I'm not having to do this, which is just annoying. I really care a lot about having a tight steering and suspension. So we're doing it. I'm a big believer in using anti-seize on everything, and a lot of it. If you're working on your own vehicle and you intend to keep that vehicle for a long time, you're going to be going back in to these parts that you've taken apart. Maybe for something else, or maybe 5-10 years from now, that part you're working on now is going to need replacement. Regardless, when that time comes, your life's going to be a hell of a lot easier if you used anti-seize on trouble spots. There are places that are very hard to get apart, like what I'm working on right now. Taking the bearing hub out is really hard if you don't know what you're doing. You haven't done it many times before. Because at the factory, they don't use any anti-seize, and this part may not come out for over 100,000 miles, and it's all fucked up. Here, this is a camber adjustment bolt that holds in the control arm. When you do an alignment, this whole bolt has to rotate. So if these get stiff, it's hard to do your alignment. So I'm going to coat this up. It'll be real easy to align now and forever. There are some fucking nerds who will whine that using anti-seize on threads ruins the torque spec, because the torque spec was made by the engineers without any lubricant on the threads. They can go fuck themselves. It's not a problem, okay? You can put anti-seize on your wheel lug studs. You do have to be aware that you might be torquing them down a little more, but it's totally academic. It's just one of those things that fucking nerds will argue about, because on paper they've convinced themselves that it matters. Rarely matters. We use marine grade anti-seize on the boat, and we use a shit ton of it on everything, because that stuff operates in some of the worst conditions on earth and has to go long periods without being taken apart. But then when it does get disassembled, we don't want to have to fuck with seized bolts, broken fasteners, all kinds of shit. Live it, love it, learn it. Anti-seize. Also known as mechanic's herpes, because once you get a little bit on you, it never goes away. This here is notorious for seizing up. It's where the bearing hub goes. And you've got to take this out in order to do your axle or your ball joint or anything. And it's pretty hard to get at these bolts. See how rusty that is in there? That whole thing, a lot of surface area. That whole thing rusts and seizes up in there. Cause you a lot of problems. So I got it out. I know how to get it out. I've done this many times. I'll probably shoot some video of that when I do the other side. But before I put this back in, this whole thing's gonna get ground out or wire wheeled out, remove all the rust, on both surfaces, and then we're going to coat everything with anti-seize to make sure this doesn't repeat. One of the most useful tools that you can have is an air hammer. Now I know in this day you got a lot of really high powered electric impacts and shop air isn't as important as it used to be. As far as I know, there's no impact tool like this, the electrical battery powered. These are so useful. They apply a huge amount of force to a very small area without a lot of extraneous movement. In areas where you can't swing a hammer, these things are fucking amazing. I probably couldn't do this job without it. That's how I get the bolts out for the to push out the hub. It's really important. And then here, there's 4 little tabs. This is the original factory ball joint. There's 4 little tabs bent over at the factory to help retain this. This one back here I haven't gotten yet. I see a lot of guys talking about grinding them out and stuff. That's not necessary if you have an air hammer, because you can just get in there and blast it, and it's fast. Hard to do with the phone out there in my hand, but that probably did it. I know you can't really see it, but that just those 2 quick little zaps blasted that tab over. No grinding, no hammers. Now I can push this thing out with the press. So here we have the lower ball joint. I decided to just pound it out with a hammer because I had the room, and I'd already bent the tabs over with the air chisel. Came out pretty easily. I am going to have to press the new one in, but that's expected. I have the press. Comparison of the old ball joint and the new ball joint. Here we've got the old one, and I can move this around real easy. There's very little resistance in here. Again, it's not blown out. It's not clunking around. I can't move this. It'll move once it's loaded and everything, and there's the suspension on it and the weight of the vehicle, but it's stiff. It's going to make a big difference in how the vehicle rides and steers. I've always liked Moog parts. They call them the problem solvers sometimes. Well, that's their tagline. They engineer their parts on their own to improve on the OEM design. Like this is a new type of dust boot, grease boot that they put on their ball joints. This old type you had to put on after you installed sometimes, or there were those tricks to those. They could easily get damaged. These are better. They seal better. This one uses a snap ring instead of those bend over tabs. Just better parts. And I don't think you can get much better unless you're going to buy some really expensive purpose build, like off-road heavy duty. And then for that sort of stuff, you're usually sacrificing something. They're usually going to, it's always a compromise. A component, can be built for certain things, but if you go too far in one direction, you're losing something in the other, like ride comfort or something like that. Now, one thing I noticed here today that's kind of disappointing, these are the control arms made in China. But then I saw over here the ball joints made in the USA. So you see this a lot these days. A brand is going to have parts built all over the world, and unfortunately, you can't say, "Oh, I'm buying Moog, good American brand." You got just as equal a chance of getting parts made in China. Doesn't mean the parts made in China are bad. China can build some pretty impressive stuff, and I'm willing to say these are probably really good quality parts. Just means my money went to China, or my money went to Moog and validated their production philosophy here of moving production overseas and still selling the products to Americans. So that kind of sucks. But I see that at work with Cat parts too. Cat parts, that's an American company, right? Well, some of it is. Some of it's made in China. Some of it's made all over the world, actually. But there's no such thing as an American company anymore. If you try to shop American, you just literally will not end up buying anything. So here we are, pressing in the lower ball joint. You don't have to buy this press. You can rent them from your chain auto parts store like AutoZone or O'Reilly's. You pay a deposit of like $100. When you turn the tool back in within like 24 hours or something, you get all the money back. So it's an easy way to use this tool. I rented this one. I've never bothered to buy one, even though I've used them dozens of times. This one's actually almost brand new. It's great. The way this works here is I screw down, it's actually gonna push the ball joint up. The ball joint's going into the lower control arm. This cup is sitting around the ball joint, or the top of the ball joint, onto the control arm. And here we're pushing on the ball joint, bringing it up. That's it. So here we are. Control arms and ball joints are in, reassembling the hub into the knuckle. As you can see, everything is coated with anti-seize inside there and on the axle. Also the bolts that are going to go in are nice and coated up. Now, I'm replacing 2 of these bolts because the act of getting the hub out, come on. The act of getting the hub out, I rounded off a little bit of these bolts. And that's no good if these are gonna go back in. They might go back in, but the day come I go to take them out again, they're gonna be all fucked up. I don't wanna deal with that. So 2 of them were messed up. That's a lot better than separating your hub, which is how a lot of people end up doing this, is they start pounding on that hub and the hub disintegrates. So these bolts are cheap compared to a hub. I'd rather do it this way, and so should you. So I'm gonna flip the script a little bit here. I know I've been talking about anti-seize, but there's one place where I don't use anti-seize and I actually use Loctite. That is the bolts that hold the caliper bracket onto the knuckle, and then also the caliper slide pin bolts themselves. I'm going to use a drop of blue Loctite on all these bolts and then torque them to the appropriate spec. I torque everything to spec anyway, but this is one spot where they do actually use anti-seize at the factory. I don't want my brakes falling off. Let's make absolutely sure that doesn't happen. Just a dot of blue Loctite will get it done. Here we are. Driver sides all back together. Everything's torqued. Everything's good. I'm going to put it back together and drive it home today, do the other side tomorrow because it's 100 degrees in here. And I got that press rented for 48 hours, so not bad, not exactly how I used to do it when I was working professionally, but watching some other guys on YouTube talking about how this took them days and they had to come back to it, and that was kind of funny. I mean, this really ain't that hard, but it cost you, what I just did, one side probably cost you $600 more if you paid to have it done. It would be nice if I had a lift, but I don't think I got the ceiling clearance for it. Plus, I don't know. It is what it is.